All right, so to get back into it, why don't we go back and review kind of this whole lesson. So using the illustration of the wedding, that to have a wedding, all you really need is a bride, a groom, a witness, an officiant, and some vows. Does that mean that you would ever tell the bride that her dress doesn't matter? Or that flowers are unimportant? Or cake is stupid? Well, this bride would thought cake is stupid, but that's a different conversation. What kind of cake, whether it's cheesecake or a nice, beautiful layer cake, that's up to the bride. But you would never say that those things are stupid or useless or pointless, that, you don't need a bridal march to have a wedding. Well, no, I suppose you don't, but if it's a big occasion, having big things involved make a difference. So what is it that matters for the Lord's Supper? What makes the Lord's Supper the Lord's Supper? Those who are here can list my 4.5 things. 4 and 5 together.
Bread, wine.
Bread, wine. Word.
Efficient.
So, the person administering the Lord's Supper and someone to receive it. You have those 5 things, you have the Lord's Supper. And then we went through each of, what those things really are. Bread is bread, fruit of the vine is wine, or the cup is wine, and then, who can officiate the Lord's Supper is a little bit of a tricky answer, because it doesn't affect how valid the Lord's Supper is depending on who gives the Lord's Supper. But the Lord sets things in order, and he entrusts the mysteries of the kingdom, and he says he's going to hold accountable those who serve him in this regard. And so really it should be a person who we feel is qualified to hold that office and to be held accountable to the Lord. And our Augsburg Confession says that no one will preach in our churches or administer the sacraments unless he is rightly called. And so while we don't base our validity on a pastor's ordination, we also recognize at the same time that in wisdom, perhaps only the pastor should be the one administering. That means officiating, overseeing the Lord's Supper. That's not talking about doing the physical work of handing cups to individuals, but the one who is overseeing the act of the Lord's Supper. Then we went through...
So it would be all right then for you to give permission to an elder or somebody to give communion to somebody that you couldn't get to. Wants it.
So, am I the one who calls people to be stewards of the mysteries of God, or is that the Holy Spirit's work through his holy church? Do I get to just appoint whoever I want to pretend to be pastor any given Sunday? To act as pastor?
No, you are the pastor.
I am the pastor. I don't get to delegate the duties that belong to the pastor and to the pastor alone to whomever I so choose. There are certainly responsibilities within the church that we do delegate and that are shared as a burden or as a trust. But the duties of preaching and teaching and administering the sacraments,
What about baptism?
Well, that's a very good question. So we made this distinction in Bible study, or in one of our previous lessons. Is there ever a time for an emergency baptism?
Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. In which case, are you going to say, well, we can't baptize because we need to be in a church, or we need the pastor to do it? Now, maybe the pastor is there if he knows it's going to be difficult and he's there to help be there for the family. But if he's not, does it need to be the pastor to apply water in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? No. But in right order, would we prefer that the pastor baptizes the child in the congregation, before the congregation, so that everyone can see what is happening and we can all rejoice in this gift of baptism? I think for good order we would say, yeah, we would prefer the pastor to do that. But there are emergency baptisms. Is there ever a case for an emergency Lord's Supper? There's never a time that if the Lord's Supper is not received, we are lacking the assurance of the gospel. Now, we certainly would want the Lord's Supper in a hospital room or at a deathbed, and shame on me if I'm unwilling or that I wouldn't go to that place. But if, things happen suddenly, it's not like you would go and say, well, I need to find bread and wine quick before this person passes away so that they can have the Lord's Supper.
Well, you could come down with COVID.
Don't, that's not.
Or just be in another state.
Yeah, you're right. So I could be in another state. There are situations where, I'm just not able. And we had one recently. I would have loved to go see Paul one last time when he started to struggle again. But the weather and the distance just, it didn't work out. So I had to, I shouldn't say simply, but I instead gave a private message for him via the internet, and that was what I could offer. But there was not a need for that. There's no doubt because he didn't receive the Lord's Supper in that last week. So, what situation is there that you would say, well, pastor's not here, we have to have the Lord's Supper? And then we briefly discussed, well, what exactly needs to be done, what rites need to be followed for it to be the Lord's Supper, and what do we always simply have to do? Go back to our list, right? And then I say, to proceed wisely, we should not play games with the list. So, things like, well, as long as the words are in the room with the bread and wine. I really feel like it should be this bread, this wine, which the pastor is then going to give to you. This is the Lord's Supper. This idea that, well, I'll just say it in the room and then all the bread and wine. I don't know, but I think that's a little unwise. If for only that it introduces doubt, and because it's now separating the whole act of the sacrament into different parts. The words are not a magic formula where if you just say the magic words, well, all bread and wine becomes the Lord's Supper, but it is a sacramental act in which we have the Lord's promise. And so instead of trying to say, well, what can we do where we still have the Lord's Supper? Let's not play that game. And that's not me saying, well, it's not a valid Lord's Supper if you do it a different way. But more me saying, I would be very cautious about separating the consecration from the actual elements that are being given. So what are your questions?
Can you give an example of that last statement?
So they're trying to be careful because I know of a Wells church where during the panic of COVID, they had the bread and wine, at least I think it was wine, in the pews for all the people, or the people took it when they went into church. They had some form where they had the bread and wine in the pew with them. And then the pastor at the altar said the words of institution. And then they were all supposed to take and eat and take and drink at the same time. I really struggle with the wisdom of that act. The altar doesn't matter. Remember, the 5 things are only there.
Uh-huh.
But Jesus took bread, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat." He took wine, took the cup, gave thanks, gave it to them, saying, "Drink from this, all of you. This is my blood." If the pastor is never even touching or near, he's never giving, it gives me a little bit of the, I know.
You went up and he gave it to you. He handed it to you.
Okay. So that,
And you took it off the plate, the cup.
yeah, and so that's a different
Oh.
type of thing.
And then we went back to the pew and then we all did it at once.
Right. So you're still, he's still, these elements are what he's blessing, and then he's giving them to you to eat and drink, and so that's a different thing then. And the other one is, I know of at least one Wells church that offers online communion, and they have for years, and I just go,
How does that work?
oh, they,
Your own bread and wine.
Go to
you
the
get your
kitchen.
own bread and wine, and then you put it, I don't know if you put it in front of your TV, and see, that's where I start going. And at the same time, in Alaska, I know that there's a pastor who serves people remotely, and they call in, but they're gathered as a group, and they're doing a set, it's strange, but I don't want to be like, absolutely not, that's not the Lord's Supper, it can't be. But at the same time, I go, ooh. And if I personally was asked to take my cup of wine and my bread into my pew, and that the pastor at the altar
You were going to say the TV. I think I couldn't get through that without laughing if I was like putting bread and wine by a TV.
Yeah, how close does it have to
I
be to the
know.
speaker? Does the pastor, I don't think I could do it. Because either I would be thinking, either it's not the sacrament, and so then I'm just eating bread and drinking wine, and I didn't go to church to eat bread and drink wine. Or I'm doubting in my mind what I'm receiving because I'm not sure. Because this is not given to me. And maybe no one in the congregation has doubts. The pastor told them, and they're all sure. I would never be able to get over it, personally. And so if I was offered the Lord's Supper that way, I would most definitely be speaking to that pastor after the service, saying, I did not take the Lord's Supper because I could not take it without doubt in my heart.
The Alaska thing intrigues me. I didn't know there is a guy that's doing that
Well,
remotely.
so in the wintertime,
they
they literally
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
serve this town. And so there's a congregation that has no pastor who lives there, and they served remotely for years. But, they have an elder, and so what I assume happens is the elder sets it up, and the pastor probably does say the words of institution over the phone. But that, it's still this is, and then it's distributed under the guidance of the pastor. And I'll trust them to work out that situation on their own. But I did bring up both when we were talking about who can officiate, but also here, there was a time in the Wells where the only time the pastors received the Lord's Supper was at pastors' conferences. And so they made sure they had 4 pastors' conferences every year, because otherwise the pastors would be starved of the sacrament, unless they had multiple pastors at the church.
Well, it must have been
30 years?
After you were born?
Probably. In a number of places.
No, 30 days.
Yeah. Yeah. And so,
Well, I remember when I was a kid, my dad giving communion.
okay.
And that was after, of course, I was 13. That was after we changed from Missouri to Wisconsin.
And so when there are changes like that, I think it's worth asking, well, what were they thinking? And were they wrong? Or maybe they, there's a middle answer there, but it's worth considering, well, what caused them to do that? And if we change something, and within the time frame of us being as wells can be, the 70s and 80s, well then, what reasoning did we have for that change? And I think there's plenty of good reason why elders would give the Lord's Supper to the pastor. I see no problem with that whatsoever. But also, before that, if the pastor was not there, the congregation didn't have the Lord's Supper. And there were often preaching stations where maybe they would read sermons, but to receive the Lord's Supper, they waited for their pastor to be there. In fact, why was it often once a month communion.
Became once a month.
Because the pastor was there once a month. And then well, we always had the Lord's Supper once a month. There wasn't a deep reason behind once a month communion other than if the pastor is serving 4 churches in a rural area, because he's the only pastor, they would have communion when the pastor was there, and when they didn't have a pastor, they would read a sermon, but they wouldn't have the Lord's Supper. So, and once again, that does not change the validity of what we're talking about now, does not change the validity of the Lord's Supper. If an elder stands at the altar, is doing the Lord's Supper in absence of the pastor, you are all receiving the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper doesn't depend on my ordination. But it's worth asking whether that's the wise course of action.
So one step further, does the pastor do it?
So, well, I mean, technically, to have the Lord's Supper, no. To be a valid Lord's Supper, no, it would not have to be enough. But for good order of the church, I mean, if you're going to have anybody, we don't really do that with anything. Like just anybody gets to do whatever they want in our Lutheran churches. But really, it should be the person called to serve that congregation who's overseeing the Lord's Supper, because the Lord will call him to an account for how he fulfills his duties. So then I ask the question, how do we proceed wisely? There's an easy answer to that. Well, I mean, it in some ways it is that simple that, well, if you just do the Lord's Supper the way that the Lord's Supper is done, you don't have to worry about any of these things. But maybe more to the point, there are certain times when we should not ask, well, what are we allowed to do? But rather to simply say, we will act in good order so that no one ever has to wonder. Are there any follow-up questions? I did admit last class, and I'll admit it again, that in this respect, I am closer to the ELS position on the pastor than I am to the majority of wells in this regard.
Communion.
On who can administer the Lord's Supper. I would say a majority of wells churches, if their pastor is gone, an elder, they would have no problem with the elder serving the Lord's Supper. And in some ways, I think that it happened because of the way we instituted our vicar program. So our vicars are not ordained. They're not pastors, they're vicars. And they serve under the guidance of a pastor. And then also at the seminary, when you go to churches and you preach for pastors, the churches don't generally change their Lord's Supper practice. So as a seminary student, I served the Lord's Supper to people who I didn't know, and they had no idea who I was or what I was doing or what. And that Lord's Supper was valid in all of those cases. But is that the wisest way? That the person serving the sacrament has no authority in that place, does not know those people, they aren't his sheep. He's barely even held responsible for what he does there. And, is that what? But I think once you do that, so there's seminary students, it's vicars. Well, certainly, actually, an elder makes more sense than a random seminary student serving the Lord's Supper, doesn't he? At least he's knows the people, and he's in spirit, some level of spiritual authority over the people who are there. So, I wonder if that's the change that brought about the next change, because you follow those things to their logical conclusion.
What does the ELS stand, how do they stand on pastor's the only one? Is that?
Yes,
what
they
you're saying? Yeah.
They have
much
elders
more
assist?
likely. Yes, they would have
Okay.
elders assist. Most of them. I'm careful with I don't know enough about the intricacy. I know quite a bit about the variations within the wells, how different wells pastors do and treat things. ELS, I'm not sure. Always.
My sister belongs to ELS, and she, I know that an elder, when the pastor gives communion, then a elder gives the pastor.
Yeah.
Similar to here.
Yeah. But I wouldn't be willing to say there are no ELS congregations where an elder would not serve the Lord's Supper in absence of the pastor. I simply don't know that information. But I do know that I would guess it's pretty much standard practice in the West. So then, if I'm uncomfortable with that, that means I'm more closely aligned with the ELS position on it than the Welsh position. And it's not really a disagreement on doctrine, it's a disagreement on, well, what is the wisest way to proceed? Just like I don't consider it a disagreement on doctrine if you have a worship leader and a worship band and all those things. But I might question the wisdom of that format in worship. So, other questions? So back to the original overarching bit of this lesson. Does the bridal procession matter? Well, it doesn't matter at all.
If you're going to do it, yes. If you don't do it, it doesn't matter.
I mean, the bride and the groom have to get to the altar somehow.
Right.
But, does it matter if dad walks the bride down the aisle and gives her to the groom? I think it does.
Cool feeling.
It's a cool feeling. It says something, doesn't it? If the father does not do that, and the vows are given, the bride and the groom are still married, right? But that's not the same thing as saying it doesn't matter. So just because it doesn't make the wedding a wedding, doesn't mean that it's not something that matters. A white dress should matter. It's a statement. It's supposed to be. All the decorations, they should matter. It says something that about what is happening in that church. That this is a once in a lifetime thing where two families are joined together and two people are going to become one flesh. I think that's worth as much pomp and circumstance as we can muster for a bride. But also, if they just say their vows, they're just as married. So, in the same way, have you observed how does your pastor stand when he says the words of institution?
Faces the altar.
Faces the altar. Do you know why?
Asking God to bless it.
Sort of. What does the altar represent? Very close. In our churches, what does the altar represent? Christ himself. Christ is where we meet with God. Where God and humanity connect is Christ. So the altar is Christ. So I am receiving these elements from Christ himself. And so I face the altar. Now, if a pastor picks up the bread or the wine and he turns and he faces the congregation, does that change what's happening? In fact, he might say, I am a representative of Christ, and so I am speaking these words, and I want to look my people in the... He can have good reasons for what he does that are completely different from what I do. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't change the Lord's Supper. What does your pastor do when he consecrates the elements?
Hold it up.
I hold them up. And when I say this is my body, I lift them even higher. At least I try to remember to. Every once in a while I'm already way up there. I'm like, uh-oh, I can't go any higher. Why do I do that?
So that we know these are the elements that are being offered.
Sort of. So that's why I lift them up. So it's this thing. There are pastors who gesture, who would stand off to the side and they'll gesture, and I've done that too. And as I said, it doesn't change what's happening. However, I think it's a weaker statement at this point. This is.
Showing it to Christ.
If I say this, Jesus says, this is my body, this is Christ for us in my hands. How can I not lift it up and show a little bit of reverence towards what is happening there? So that is my confession. I'm showing that this is a sacred thing. This is Christ himself given for us in this room. There are those you can see where they're a little bit more into the ceremonies, where there's actually a bow, where pastors will bow to the elements. I think that's strange in our own. It seems strange to us, and so I'll just lift the elements. But it's the same confession. This is Christ for me. How can I not elevate him above myself? How should a person receive the bread? The hand on the tongue? Doesn't matter. All of you receive it on your hand. Previous congregations, I had a number of people who preferred they would not touch it. They wanted to receive it directly from the pastor, which meant that they stuck
When
their...
you first came here, that's the way I did it.
Which,
I don't know if you remember
I
that,
do.
Because that's how I grew up.
yeah. It means that people end up half the people are sticking their tongue out at the pastor as we get the Lord's Supper. But that confession is, I want to receive Christ directly. And so, and even if you didn't even think about it that way, that is what you are confessing, that I'm not even going to handle this thing because it is so holy. Now the disciples took the bread and they broke it and passed it. So, once again, doesn't change anything about the Lord's Supper. But there is a confession there. Common versus individual cup. Let's see, here we are. Just about 50-50. Does it matter? Is there a confession in the common cup? Yeah.
That's the way Christ did it.
Well, it is the way that Christ did it, but to me that's just like, I don't need to know what kind of bread Jesus used, other than he used unleavened bread, but leavened bread is still bread. I don't need to know whether he used wheat or barley or rye or something else for it to be the Lord's Supper. In the same way, or that, well, was it a big loaf that he broke and passed piece down and they all, I don't need to worry about that sort of thing. But there is a confession that we are all partakers of the same loaf. We are all partakers of the same cup, is what we confess in 1 Corinthians 10. And so that confession is a valuable one, that we share in this fellowship together. We all drink one cup. However, the individual cups does not diminish the gift that the Lord gives you. But I would say that it does slightly diminish that confession of unity. I don't think there's any way around it. But would I rather people receive the body and blood of the Lord's Supper than they shied away because it's weird or gross to drink from the same cup because it's not something we do as Americans? Standing or kneeling? We don't get to kneel. Stop kneeling after COVID. Why did I not reinstitute kneeling?
There's a lot of people
So
who
there's
have
enough
trouble
people
with their
who can't.
knees.
The truth of the matter is there's a number of people that I'm not sure would get back up after kneeling down. And so instead of worrying about that or making people feel uncomfortable or feeling like they're obligated to kneel or to rise, we all stand. This is one that I struggle with simply because,
You kneel once in a while.
yeah, if I'm by myself, I kneel. I struggle with it because growing up, you had to climb 7 steps at my church. And then you knelt around the altar. And there were elderly people who walked to the front and the pastor came down to give them the Lord's Supper afterwards, like I do with Betty and with Jerry. But most of the congregation still did that. They still climbed the steps. And they got rid of it because it was too slow, and then people complained because church was an hour and 5 minutes, and then they missed kickoff, and then the whole day was ruined. And so they now line up across the whole front, and they have a separate. They don't use the altar. They have a separate table where the elements are. That would be a long walk back and forth from the altar. But
Our church had kneelers in the pew too. You went up to communion and you knelt, and you walked up steps to go to communion, and you knelt, and you came back, and you pulled out the kneeler, and you knelt after communion as well.
At our church, we didn't have kneelers, but every single person, as they came back from communion, would kneel on the floor. Yeah.
And I've had to pick someone up off the floor for, 3 steps in Two Rivers? 2 steps?
Yeah.
We had 5 cement steps. I don't ever remember having to pick anybody up. I don't know that ever happened.
And so,
And maybe it was just,
as I say, I think everyone just assumed this is what we do because why? Well, because what we did. But why? Why bother kneeling? I mean, guess what? Your grandparents didn't have an easier time kneeling than you do.
It's reverence.
Humility, reverence. What do you do when you stand before the king to receive, when you go before the king to receive his gifts? You kneel. And so it's just built into, if you would kneel before an earthly king, how are you going to go before your heavenly king standing? Is kind of the thought process. Now, you've all seen The King and I? You all seen The King and I? Why is your head always higher than mine? And they do the game where he keeps, and she has to get lower than him all the time. Is your head ever going to be higher than the Lord's? No. So do you need to kneel to show reverence to? No. You're not exalting yourself above the Lord because you're standing. But that confession was built in when people were used to kneeling before their monarch. Well, if we're going before King Jesus, you better believe we're going to kneel. And so that was just built in. It didn't matter how much your knees ached because you kneel before the monarch. So that's the confession that they were making. What do we do with the leftovers? Okay, so the leftover bread, what do we do with it?
Back in the package.
Well, actually, it sits in the pad.
Oh,
Waits till next time. What do we do with leftover wine?
pour it back.
Individual cups is easy. This goes back in the bottle. You're going to put the common cup back in the bottle? No. What did they used to do with the leftover?
Drink it.
They would drink it. The priest would drink it down. And I mentioned this at the Catholic church that I've been to 2 Catholic masses, both funerals. He drank the whole wine. Then he put holy consecrated water in, swirled it around, drank that, did it again. Then he wiped the cup with a napkin so that there was no doubt that there is no trace of this left in there. Why?
The blood of Jesus.
Yeah, you aren't going to let the blood... So he's confessing something when he does all that. When I take the cup from the Lord's Supper off our altar, I walk it outside and I pour it on the ground. Because there's a confession there that this was set aside for a sacred purpose. I'm not saying it's still the blood of Jesus apart from the use in the Lord's Supper. It's we don't have little bits of the blood of Jesus in our wine bottle in the fridge waiting for next time. But that wine's still going to be used for a sacred purpose. It's not being... There's something that makes me uncomfortable pouring it down the sink where it goes into our water treatment facilities with all the other things that go into our water treatment facilities. So I prefer to dump it outside. Just as Jesus spilled his blood on the ground, so also this can be poured out to the Lord. Because matter? Does it matter? Yeah, a little bit. But-
Audio.
Absolutely. It matters, but only a little bit. In the past, a lot of churches were built with a sink in their sacristy that had a pipe going outside. So you would dump the wine in there, and it would flow through a pipe and go out onto the ground outside. And then you could even turn on the water and rinse it so that it wasn't sitting there in the week. What are your questions? You have about 30 seconds.
What was Luther's practices, do we know? In terms of in relationship to what we do?
So, that's a really hard question to answer. We can look at artwork, but that's only so good. In general, Luther tried his best to preserve all rites and ceremonies that could be preserved without misleading people. So if a practice would lead people to think in a Roman Catholic way, he abandoned that practice. But if a practice was good and useful and the people were used to it, his practice was, I will keep this so that the people are not lost and confused, and so that they realize that we are still celebrating the same sacrament. But do I know which direction Luther faced? I mean, I can say probably 95% he faced the altar. I'm guessing he elevated the host. Can I say that for sure? I don't do that when I'm giving the Lord's Supper in private either, because mostly I'd be afraid as I'm lifting it up, a cup would fall off my tray and I'd drop it, and that would be a worse thing than the necessariness of the confession. If you have other questions, write them down. We can talk about it next time. Next time we're going to talk about closed communions.
Good. One quick question. The Catholics in communion, do the congregation take the wine?
I've never seen them. But I do know that they are allowed to.